December 1944. Deep inside the steel hull of the USS New Jersey, a weathered manual sits on a teak desk, its pages bearing a chilling warning. The fury of a tropical cyclone is impossible to imagine until experienced. Just steps away, Commander George Costco watches his barometer plummet, yet he remains eerily calm. He trusts his charts. He trusts the legendary bull Halsey. Beyond the portholes, the horizon isn't just darkening, it is vanishing. 300 miles off Luzon, the most formidable naval strike force ever assembled. Task Force 38 is about to meet an adversary that doesn't fly a rising sun flag. Massive carriers are tossing like toys, and destroyers are tilting toward a point of no return, their engines screaming against an invisible wall of water. How could a fleet built to crush empires be defeated? And what happens when a commander's greatest strength, his iron, will become his men's greatest shadow? Stay with us until the very end, as we descend into the eye of the storm to discover the heavy price of a single silent mistake. By December 1944, the Pacific Theater had reached a decisive turning point. Following the catastrophic losses at the Battle of the Philippine Sea and the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy was a fractured shell of its former self. This shift in power allowed the U.S. Third Fleet to operate with a new level of dominance spearheaded by the formidable Task Force 38. Boasting 7 Essex-class fleet carriers and a massive screen of battleships and destroyers, their mission was to secure the final victory by paralyzing Japanese airfields ahead of the Luzon invasion. However, this momentum faced a complex two-front challenge: the logistical constraint. Despite their military dominance, the fleet's smaller destroyers were critically low on fuel by December 16th. This created a dangerous technical imbalance. They were top-heavy, carrying massive anti-aircraft armaments, but lacking the fuel weight in their lower tanks required for stability in heavy seas. And the tactical pressure. While Japan was weakened, the emergence of kamikaze suicide strikes created a new kind of volatility. For Admiral Halsey, withdrawing the fleet to avoid a storm wasn't just a safety maneuver, it was a strategic risk. Moving away meant leaving General MacArthur's invasion forces without air cover, potentially giving the wounded Japanese Navy a window to strike back. As the weather worsened, Halsey was forced into a high-stakes calculation. He had to choose between the immediate necessity of refueling to maintain combat readiness and the tactical requirement to stay on station. With the Japanese Navy seemingly on its knees, the decision to push through the weather appeared to be a manageable gamble, a choice between a known enemy in the air and an uncertain rising threat on the horizon. As Task Force 38 maneuvered deep into the Philippine Sea, a silent internal crisis was already unfolding beneath the steel decks of its most vital protectors. By December 16, 1944, the smaller destroyers, the agile workhorses tasked with shielding the massive carriers, were running dangerously low on fuel, with several reporting their tanks had plummeted below 15% capacity. In the unforgiving logic of naval architecture, a ship without fuel is not merely a vessel without power. It is a vessel without balance. This set the stage for a lethal collision between human desperation and the laws of physics. To counter the terrifying rise of kamikaze suicide strikes, these destroyers, particularly the aging Farragut class, had been retrofitted into floating arsenals. Every available inch of deck space was crammed with heavy 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon anti-aircraft guns, alongside massive newly developed radar arrays. While this firepower offered protection from the air, it acted as an internal enemy, moving the ship's center of gravity dangerously high above the waterline. Under normal conditions, these steel giants were formidable, but the addition of hundreds of tons of weaponry on their upper decks meant that if they tilted beyond a critical angle, roughly 70 degrees, the very guns meant to save the crews would act as a massive lever, pinning the vessel down and preventing it from ever righting itself. The danger was exponentially magnified by the high-stakes gamble of ballasting. Standard maritime safety requires a light ship to pump seawater into its empty fuel tanks to act as a counterweight, lowering its center of gravity. However, on the morning of December 17th, as the fleet prepared for a scheduled refueling rendezvous, many captains made the fateful decision to flush out their seawater ballast to make room for the incoming fresh oil. This left the destroyers in their most precarious state, light at the bottom and heavy at the top, bobbing like corks with lead weights glued to their tips. Admiral Halsey, prioritizing combat readiness, pushed the fleet forward into the mounting swells, unknowingly commanding a line of unstable pendulums, just as the first signs of a monster began to appear on the horizon. Yet this mechanical instability was only half of the tragedy. Within the command center of the USS New Jersey, a total collapse of meteorological intelligence was underway. The warnings were loud and clear as early as the evening of December 16th, APBM. Mariner Flying Boat had reported a massive storm system with 65-knot winds just 250 miles away, and weather stations in Saipan had issued a formal typhoon warning. But Commander George F. Cosco, the fleet's chief forecaster, remained in a fog of misplaced confidence. Relying on historical patterns and distant reports, rather than the frantic data from the scout planes, Cosco convinced Admiral Halsey that they were merely facing a standard cold front, a bout of rough weather that the mighty Third Fleet could easily push through. This predictive failure highlighted a simmering generational rift within the Navy. Halsey and his inner circle represented the old salt school of thought, where a commander's intuitive sea sense was considered superior to the flickering blips on a radar screen. To these veteran officers, the newly installed radar systems, which were actually picking up the strange mass of the Typhoon's eye wall, were unproven gadgets. There was a profound skepticism toward the younger, new-tech officers who spoke the language of atmospheric pressure and radar signatures. This cultural arrogance created a vacuum where objective data was filtered through a lens of tactical bravado. The fleet was flying blind, not because it lacked eyes, but because its leaders refused to believe what those eyes were seeing. By the time the morning of December 17, 1944 broke across the Philippine Sea, the atmosphere had shifted into something unrecognizable to the veteran sailors of Task Force 38. The sky, a bruised and sickly shade of purple, seemed to press down on the ocean, while the swells that had once been manageable expanded into towering vertical walls of white-capped water. For Admiral William Bull Halsey, the situation was becoming a logistical nightmare. His fleet, the most potent assembly of naval power in history, was parched. His destroyers were low on fuel, their stability compromised by the very lack of weight in their bellies. At exactly 12:51 p.m., Halsey was forced to acknowledge a grim reality. Continuing to refuel his thirsting ships in these conditions was a death sentence for the men on deck. Steel lines were snapping with the force of whip cracks, and massive hulls were slamming into one another with bone-jarring impact. He issued the order to cease all replenishment operations, but his next decision would prove to be the most fateful of the entire campaign. Halsey's strategic logic at this moment was not governed by the sea, but by the ghost of the kamikaze. He was haunted by the fear that If he retreated too far to the west to evade the brewing storm, he would inadvertently sail into the lethal strike range of Japanese land-based aircraft stationed on Luzon. In Halsey's mind, the enemy he could see, the Imperial Japanese Navy, was a far greater threat than the weather system his meteorologists assured him was merely a standard cold front. Consequently, he chose to double down, ordering the fleet to maintain a tight, rigid formation and steer toward the south. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Because Commander Costco had provided faulty meteorological data, Halsey did not realize that by steering south, he was not escaping the typhoon. Instead, he was inadvertently positioning the entire Third Fleet on a direct collision course with the advancing eye of Typhoon Cobra. He was steering his steel giants into the path of a monster they were never designed to fight. As the clock ticked into the early hours of December 18th, the strange mass that had flickered on the primitive radar screens was no longer a meteorological curiosity. It was an all-encompassing reality. The first victims of this tactical error were the Independence-class light carriers. These vessels were the Frankensteins of the American fleet, hastily converted from cruiser hulls early in the war to meet the desperate demand for mobile air power. While they were fast, their narrow hulls and top-heavy hangar decks made them notoriously unstable. In the churning, chaotic seas of the Typhoon, they became erratic pendulums. The USS Monterey, in particular, became the epicenter of this structural agony. As the ship rolled violently, reaching a terrifying 70-degree list that defied the laws of naval buoyancy, the heavy steel lashings in the hangar deck began to snap. Unsecured fighter planes weighing several tons each transformed into lethal projectiles. They slid across the grease-slicked decks with uncontrollable momentum, smashing into one another and rupturing fuel lines. In the pitch-black darkness of the tilting hangar, a spark ignited a ruptured tank, and soon a massive, uncontrollable inferno was raging deep within the ship's bowels. It was during this desperate battle against fire and water that a young general quarters officer was nearly claimed by the abyss. As he was thrown from a ladder by a particularly violent roll and swept across the heaving, rain-slicked flight deck toward the edge, he managed to narrowly avoid a 60-foot drop into the churning sea by sliding into a small, recessed catwalk. That officer was Lieutenant Gerald R. Ford, the future 38th President of the United States. His survival was a matter of inches, a stark reminder of how close the storm came to altering American history. But the Monterey was not alone in its torment. On the USS Cowpens, the wind was so fierce that 7 aircraft were washed overboard, like autumn leaves lost forever to the deep. On the USS San Jacinto, a fighter plane broke loose in the hangar and proceeded to demolish 7 other aircraft, sparking another dangerous blaze. Meanwhile, the USS Langley rolled so severely that its flight deck nearly kissed the roiling surface of the ocean. On these light carriers, the war against the Japanese Empire had effectively ceased. There were no longer any pilots or admirals. There were only men struggling to prevent their ships from becoming floating bombs as ammunition and fuel threatened to ignite. Task Force 38, the apex predator of the Pacific, was no longer an aggressor. It had been reduced to a collection of drowning giants gasping for air and fighting for every inch of stability as the heart of Typhoon Cobra moved in for the kill. While the infernos on the light carriers drew the frantic attention of the fleet's core, a more isolated and absolute struggle was unfolding on the outskirts of Task Force 38. The Fletcher-class destroyer, USS Spence, became a helpless victim in a failed battle against the very element that sustained it. By the early hours of December 18th, the Spence was a mechanical shell of its former self. Its fuel reserves had plummeted to a critical 15%. The ship was dangerously light, riding high in the water and bobbing like a discarded cork atop 60-foot mountains of churning predatory brine. In the brutal, unforgiving calculus of naval architecture, the Spence was a disaster that had already occurred. It was simply waiting for the final kinetic catalyst. So, what was the real reason the USS Spence turned into a steel grave for more than 300 people? We must dissect the hidden mechanisms of this disaster, specifically the phenomenon known as the free surface effect. Throughout the preceding 24 hours, the ship's command had intentionally delayed the standard emergency procedure of water, ballasting, the act of pumping seawater into empty fuel tanks to add weight to the keel and lower the center of gravity. This decision was rooted in a desire to remain clean and ready for an immediate refueling rendezvous with the fleet oilers, avoiding the arduous task of flushing out seawater later. However, as the eye wall of Typhoon Cobra slammed into the fleet, that tactical delay transitioned into a death sentence. When the order to finally ballast was issued, the physics of the storm had already bypassed the capacity of the ship's engineering. The pumps, struggling against the violent rhythmic heaving of the vessel, were unable to fill the tanks completely. This created the lethal free surface effect. The tanks were neither solid with fuel nor solid with water. Instead, they contained massive shifting volumes of liquid that sloshed uncontrollably from port to starboard with every roll. This internal momentum acted as a subterranean battering ram, erratically shifting the ship's center of gravity and systematically stripping away its righting arm, the natural ability of a hull to snap back to an upright position after a heavy tilt. The Spence was no longer a stabilized vessel. It was an erratic top-heavy pendulum swinging toward its own terminal velocity. By 11 a.m., the atmosphere on the bridge of the Spence had devolved into a scene of pure, unadulterated terror that transcends traditional naval records. The wind, screaming at sustained speeds exceeding 110 knots, had reached a frequency so high it literally drowned out human vocal cords. Orders had to be communicated through desperate gestures and sheer instinct. The sea was no longer composed of recognizable waves, but had dissolved into a horizontal chaotic blur of blinding white spray and a deep gray abyss. The ship was rolling to 50 degrees, then 60, lingering at the apex of each roll for heart-stopping seconds, as if contemplating its own surrender. Inside the hull, the crew lived through a spatial nightmare where floors became vertical walls and ceilings became treacherous pitfalls. Men clung to whatever steel fixtures they could find as heavy equipment tore loose from its moorings in the darkness, transforming into lethal projectiles that shattered bone and bulkhead alike. Then the final mechanical collapse arrived. The distribution board failed under the strain of the rolls, plunging the interior into a suffocating total darkness. Almost simultaneously, the rudder jammed hard to the right. The Spence was now dead in the water, a term that took on a literal chilling finality as the vessel fell broadside into the troughs of the monstrous swells, unable to steer into the wind to save itself. The end arrived with a sickening heavy finality just after noon. A massive, monolithic wall of water, towering high above the ship's funnels, struck the Spence, while it was already leaning precariously to port at a 72-degree angle. Because of the half-filled tanks and the lack of low-level ballast, the ship had reached its point of no return. It did not simply tilt, it yielded to the weight of the ocean. The Spence rolled onto its side, and the cold, pressurized Pacific poured into its ventilators, hatches, and funnels with a roar that signaled the instantaneous end of 317 lives. In less than 4 minutes, the proud destroyer slipped beneath the churning surface, leaving behind nothing but a frantic, bubbling patch of oil and debris that was quickly swallowed by the spray. Out of a crew of nearly 340 men, only 23 would emerge from the boiling sea left to face the predatory sharks and the freezing wind alone. The Spence was the first of the Phantoms to be officially claimed by Cobra, a victim of a tactical gamble where the stakes were fuel and the price was an entire generation of sailors. The USS Hull was the next to face the ultimate reckoning as the ephemeral shadow of Typhoon Cobra transitioned into a physical crushing weight that no amount of naval tradition could repel. While the modern Fletcher-class ships like the USS Spence struggled primarily with the logistics of fuel levels, a different and more systemic kind of nightmare was unfolding for the older veteran members of the Third Fleet, the Farragut-class destroyers. These vessels, specifically the USS Hull and the USS Monaghan, represented the old guard of the United States Navy, sturdy, reliable craft built in the mid-1930s that had already survived the darkest, most desperate days of the Pacific theater. However, they were victims of a technological paradox. They had never been designed to carry the immense modern weight of advanced radar arrays and dense anti-aircraft weaponry that had been hastily retrofitted onto their decks to combat the kamikaze threat. Nor were their aging frames ever intended to withstand a meteorological anomaly as concentrated and violent as Cobra. Unlike the Spence, the Hull was not critically low on fuel. She was carrying roughly 70% of her maximum capacity. But her inherent design flaw had become a terminal liability. The added weight of Bofor's guns and radar masts high above the waterline had pushed her center of gravity to a precarious height, a condition known as being top-heavy. By 11 a.m. on December 18th, the Hull was locked in a horrific losing dance with a wind that had reached sustained speeds of 110 knots. This was a force so absolute it transcended the definition of weather. It became a physical wall of pressure, an invisible hand pressing against the ship's superstructure with the intent to flatten it. The hull began to roll to 50, then 60 degrees, and with each agonizing tilt, the Pacific Ocean crept higher up her slanted, rain-slicked deck. Inside the hull, the atmosphere was a chaotic symphony of screaming wind, groaning steel, and the thunderous crashing of unsecured equipment that had been torn from its moorings. The crew fought with a desperate animalistic intensity, but they were fighting a fundamental battle against gravity that was mathematically impossible to win. At approximately 12:10 p.m., a massive gust pinned the hull down at an 80-degree angle. For a single agonizing heartbeat, she lingered there, her funnels almost horizontal to the roiling surface of the water. Then, the ocean poured into her stacks in a deafening roar of steam and darkness, extinguishing her boilers instantly. The hull surrendered to the abyss, capsizing so rapidly that 202 men were pulled down into the depths before they could even grasp a life ring. Only 62 men survived the initial sinking cast into a sea that remained hell-bent on their total extinction. Simultaneously, the USS Monaghan was undergoing a parallel martyrdom that stripped away the prestige of her legendary service record. The Monaghan was a true titan of the Pacific, a vessel decorated with 12 battle stars that had famously sunk a Japanese midget submarine during the attack on Pearl Harbor and fought through the harrowing fires of Midway. Yet, in the heart of the storm, Her combat honors were rendered meaningless by the cold laws of naval physics. Like the Hull, the Monaghan was dangerously top-heavy, but her specific doom was sealed by a mechanical failure of the smallest, most tragic order. Her seawater ballast valves had jammed. As her fuel tanks emptied and her hull grew lighter and more unstable, the crew fought with frantic bleeding hands to open the valves and take on the seawater weight needed to lower her center of gravity. They simply ran out of time. At 11:30 a.m., the Monaghan lost all electrical power, plunging her interior into a suffocating darkness. Without power, her steering failed, and the ship fell helplessly into the trough, the deep valley between massive vertical waves where a destroyer is most vulnerable to being rolled. A succession of monolithic white-capped swells hammered the Monaghan until her structural integrity failed. She rolled over like a wounded animal and vanished beneath the spray. Out of her heroic, battle-hardened crew, 256 men were lost to the sea. In a haunting testament to the sheer, unbridled violence of Typhoon Cobra, only 6 men from the Monaghan would eventually be pulled from the water, alive, the sole witnesses to the ship's final violent moments. However, amidst this graveyard of steel and shattered lives, 2 ships, the USS Aylwin and the USS Dewey, offered a masterclass in the razor-thin margin between survival and extinction. Their survival stories provide the critical technical and psychological comparison that explains why they remained afloat, while the Hull and the Monaghan were consumed. The survival of the USS Aylwin was a feat of pure collective engineering endurance. Struck by a wall of water that sent her into a catastrophic 70-degree list, the Aylwin remained pinned on her side for 20 harrowing minutes, her deck rails submerged and her fate seemingly sealed. Water began pouring through a broken hatch on the weather deck, shorting out her generators and plunging the ship into a humid, terrifying darkness where the only sound was the roar of the ocean. Yet beneath the waterline, in the boiling bowels of the ship, the engineering crew refused to abandon their posts, even as the floors became walls. They worked in the sweltering, airless heat of the boiler room, where temperatures reached a staggering 180 degrees Fahrenheit, in desperate 10-minute shifts, gasping for oxygen and fighting the humidity to keep the fires alive. This Herculean, near-superhuman effort allowed the Aylwin to maintain just enough steam pressure to eventually right herself and maneuver her bow back into the wind. It was a victory of human will over mechanical failure, a survival bought with the sweat and lungs of men who refused to let their ship drown in the darkness. The USS Dewey, however, provided the most definitive and radical lesson in naval survival during the entire ordeal. Her captain and crew recognized the top-heavy death sentence early in the storm's development and took decisive, almost brutal action to counter it. While the Hull and the Monaghan were being pinned down by the weight of their own defenses, the crew of the Dewey began a frantic mission to jettison anything that was not bolted to the deck. They hacked away at heavy topside equipment, threw tons of ammunition overboard, and most importantly, successfully ballasted their empty tanks with seawater long before the eye wall of the storm arrived. Even with these precautions, the Dewey came within inches of total destruction. A massive roll ripped the ship's funnel clean off the deck, but paradoxically, this disaster became her salvation. By losing the smokestack, the Dewey significantly reduced her sail area, the total surface area the wind could push against to force a capsize. With a lower center of gravity from the seawater ballast and less surface area for the 110-knot winds to grip, the Dewey was able to bob back up from rolls that would have inevitably capsized her sister ships. When we compare these 4 ships, the physics of failure becomes starkly, hauntingly clear. The USS Hull and the USS Monaghan were victims of their own history. Their aging frames were burdened with too much modern weight and lacked the proactive ballasting needed to compensate for the top-heavy retrofits. The USS Spence died because her command prioritized clean fuel tanks and refueling logistics over immediate raw stability. In contrast, the USS Dewey lived because her crew embraced a brutal, unsentimental necessity. They destroyed and discarded parts of their own ship to save the lives of the men within it. They understood that in the grip of a 110-knot wind, every pound of weight on the deck is an ally of the ocean, and every gallon of water in the keel is an ally of the crew. The Dewey survived because she was willing to become ugly, battered funnelless, and waterlogged, while her sisters remained clean and fully equipped all the way to the bottom of the Pacific. It was the ultimate demonstration that in the face of a typhoon, the only law that matters is the law of the center of gravity. As the USS Hull and USS Spence vanished beneath the churning surface of the Philippine Sea, they left behind a scattered, broken trail of humanity that would endure one of the most harrowing survival ordeals in naval history. For the survivors, the immediate explosive terror of their ship's final moments was replaced by a slow, agonizing descent into a psychological and physical purgatory. For the next 51 hours, these men were no longer elite sailors of the world's most formidable navy. They were mere organic matter floating in a predatory wasteland. The ocean still whipped into a violent frenzy by the retreating typhoon. Cobra offered absolutely no sanctuary. The water, stripped of its tropical warmth by the upwelling of freezing currents from the depths, became a heat-leaching shroud. Hypothermia began its silent, methodical work, dulling the cognitive senses and inducing a state of waking delirium. In this floating limbo, the line between the stinging salt spray of the waves and the vivid hallucinations born of sheer exhaustion blurred into a single, terrifying reality. But the numbing cold was merely the first predator. As the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the survivors into a claustrophobic, moonless darkness, a new horror emerged from the abyss, one that defines survival horror in its purest form. Attracted by the rhythmic vibrations of the sinkings and the unmistakable scent of blood and fuel oil, the sharks arrived. In the pitch black, the men could not see the fins. They could only feel the presence. It began with sudden, forceful nudges against dangling boots, or the sandpaper-like brush of dorsal skin against a bare leg. Then came the screams. In the rare silences between the howling gusts of wind, a sailor would suddenly vanish with a sharp, truncated cry, leaving his comrades to huddle closer together in their oil-slicked life rings. They knew with a sickening certainty that every splash, every frantic kick was a direct invitation to the shadows circling beneath their feet. For 2 days and nights they remained in a state of hypervigilance, their eyes chemically burned by salt, and their skin peeling in agonizing sheets from prolonged exposure to floating fuel oil, waiting for a rescue that the High Command had not even authorized. While these men fought a losing battle against the elements and the predators, a different kind of conflict was being waged on the bridge of a small destroyer escort, the USS Tabor. Its commander, Lieutenant Commander Henry L. Plage, was witnessing a moral emergency that superseded naval protocol. As the storm subsided, Admiral Halsey had issued a standing order for the battered remains of the 3rd Fleet to regroup at Ulithi to reorganize for the war effort. To the High Command, the mission was the priority. The individual lives lost in the waves were a regrettable statistic of war. But Plage, whose own ship had narrowly survived a 60-degree roll that snapped its mast like a twig, spotted a lone, flickering light, in the distance a single survivor from the hull. In an act of profound moral courage that risked his entire military career, Plage made a decisive choice. He either did not receive, or more likely deliberately ignored the repeated urgent orders from Halsey's flagship to regroup. Instead of turning towards safety, he turned the Tabor back into the heart of the disaster zone to commence a desperate, unauthorized box search. For the next 51 hours, Plage and his crew defied the tunnel vision of war. They navigated through treacherous debris fields and thick oil slicks, their searchlights cutting through the obsidian darkness to locate men who had long since surrendered to despair. The crew of the Tabor operated with a level of heroism that matched their captain. They risked their own lives diving into shark-infested waters with nets and life rings. To protect the survivors as they were being hauled up the side of the ship, sailors stood on the rolling decks firing rifles into the water, desperately trying to drive away the sharks that were closing in on their exhausted brothers. The results of Plage's defiance were nothing short of staggering. By the time the rest of the Third Fleet was finally ordered to join the search on December 21st, nearly 3 days too late, the Tabor had already single-handedly pulled 55 men from the water, 41 from the hull, and 14 from the Spence. Eventually, they were relieved by 2 additional destroyers who managed to find a few more survivors before the search was officially called off on the 22nd. By that point, the ocean had claimed the rest. The fleet-wide rescue efforts were mostly futile, as the window for human survival had slammed shut. In total, only 93 men were rescued from the 3 sunken destroyers. To put Plage's initiative into perspective, more than half of every life saved that day was due to the actions of one commander who chose the law of the sea over the orders of the Admiral. For this extraordinary bravery, Lieutenant Commander Plage was awarded the Legion of Merit, and the USS Tabor received the Navy Unit Commendation. By the time the winds of Typhoon Cobra finally dissipated over the Philippine Sea, the silence that followed was heavy, with a staggering realization the United States Third Fleet had suffered its most humiliating defeat of the war, and not a single Japanese shell had been fired. The final tally of the destruction was a grim testament to the absolute power of the ocean. 790 American sailors were dead or missing, lost to the depths and the predators of the Pacific. The fleet's physical losses were equally staggering. 3 destroyers, the Spence, the Hull, and the Monaghan, lay on the ocean floor. 146 aircraft had been shredded by the winds or swept overboard, and 27 other vessels were left limping toward repair docks, many with structural damage so severe they were effectively removed from the war effort for months. In a haunting comparison that sent shockwaves through the Navy, the damage inflicted by the storm exceeded what the Japanese Empire had managed to accomplish in many major direct naval engagements. The search for answers led to a court of inquiry convened at the remote naval base of Ulithi on December 26, 1944. Presided over by Vice Admiral John Hoover, with Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz in attendance, the proceedings were as much about the soul of the Navy as they were about the facts of the storm. The court faced a profound dilemma: how to judge a living legend like Admiral William "Bull" Halsey. After days of testimony, the conclusion was inescapable. The court formally placed the primary responsibility for the disaster on Admiral Halsey. They found that his insistence on refueling in a storm zone and his failure to heed the meteorological warnings were the direct causes of the loss of life However, in a move that remains controversial to this day, the court stopped short of a court-martial. They classified Halsey's actions not as negligence, but as an error of judgment committed under the immense stress of war and a commendable yet ultimately fatal desire to meet military requirements. While Halsey was spared his career, the Navy was not spared the lesson. The tragedy of Typhoon Cobra became the catalyst for a fundamental overhaul of how the military interacted with the natural world. It was the smoking gun that proved sea sense and intuition were no longer enough to protect a modern global fleet. This disaster led directly to the establishment of dedicated professional weather centers in the Pacific, the precursors to today's Joint Typhoon Warning Center, JTWC. The Navy realized that to rule the waves, it first had to understand the winds, shifting from a culture of tactical bravado to one of scientific vigilance. As we look back at the churning waters of 1944, the story of Typhoon Cobra stands as a permanent monument to the virtue of humility. It is a stark reminder that even when humanity possesses the most formidable ham fleet ever assembled, a force capable of toppling empires and reshaping history, we remain fundamentally small in the shadow of the natural world. Task Force 38 had the steel, the fire, and the men to win a world war, but it lacked the humility to bow before the storm until it was forced to its knees. The tunnel vision of war had blinded its leaders. They were so focused on the enemy they could fight with guns that they forgot their oldest and most powerful adversary, the sea itself. The ocean does not care for battle stars, for military rank, or for the strategic importance of a mission. It operates by its own ancient mathematical laws of gravity and momentum. Typhoon Cobra serves as a haunting echo from the past, whispering a truth that every mariner must eventually learn in the vast, unforgiving theater of the deep. The Admiral may command the fleet, but it is the ocean that truly holds command. Finally, before we conclude today's message, thank you for standing with us in the heart of this history. We offer our final thoughts as a solemn tribute to the 790 souls, the brave sons, brothers, and sailors of the Hull, Monaghan, and Spence, who rest forever in the silent depths of the Philippine Sea since December 1944. Their courage, though tested by an adversary mightier than any fleet, remains an eternal echo of sacrifice. If you have a personal story or a family connection to these men that you'd like to share, please join the conversation in the comments below. Your words help ensure their names are never forgotten. If this journey moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to help us keep these legacies alive. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in our next exploration.